Dr. Solomon Dersso, founding director of Amani Africa, joining us live this hour from Addis Ababa. Doctor, thank you very much for joining us. Just begin by telling us what's your assessment of the implementation of the Declaration of Principles signed by the two sides 10 days ago now.
Thank you very much for having me. First, I think it's important to emphasize the importance of the signing of the Declaration of Principles itself, since the DRC government actually made it clear for quite some time that it was not willing to negotiate separately with the M23. But in this instance, this dialogue in Qatar, there was a direct negotiation separately with the M23, rather than what was provided for under the Nairobi process, which was meant to include talks between the DRC government and all other armed groups. Second, in terms of the implementation, it's important to underscore that the Declaration of Principles had at least three broad areas that it covers. The first of this has to do with ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. There have been various incidents of fighting continuing subsequent to the signing of this Declaration of Principles on the 19th of July. And this is symbolic and emblematic of the continuing challenge that the two sides, the DRC government and the M23, face. And of course, this also has to do with the modalities, the lack of clarity on the modalities of implementation, on the question of also what happens in the event of non-compliance and who monitors whether or not, who is responsible for what kind of breaches. And you also have issues relating to the implementation of also the exchange of prisoners, issues relating to the restoration of state authority, some of which, like the restoration of state authority, have actually a lot of issues that are yet to be negotiated and settled. And of course, there are questions around the future of the M23 itself.
Right, Doctor, let me just jump in there. You've talked about the fresh demands. Both the AIFC and M23 we've been hearing have made fresh demands for the release of prisoners. Why now, and what is the likely impact of the resumption of the talks, as well as the deadline of August the 18th to sign a final peace accord?
Well, the issue related to relief of prisoners, as you may recall, and indeed, as your reporter indicated, forms part and parcel of the Declaration of Principles. They are considered to be what are called the confidence-building measures. And the lack of implementation or the demand for release of prisoners by the M23 is indicative of the lack of progress around the implementation of that side of the Declaration of Principles. In terms of the impact of this, I think it's worth saying that generally in the mediation world, deadline diplomacy is a very problematic approach to negotiation, particularly in a protracted conflict like this one. And therefore, I think I would imagine that there would indeed be follow-up between the two sides for subsequent talks. But it is difficult to imagine that this very narrow deadline would be enough for the two sides actually to really hammer out all the major outstanding issues, including the negotiations around what are called the root causes.
Right. And finally, Doctor, we have, of course, been hearing that the leaders of both DRC and Rwanda are expected in Washington. What's your take on the increasing role of the United States in the Doha process?
Well, the U.S. has been involved in trying to stabilize and create political conditions and talks between the DRC and Rwanda for some time. And as in March, there was a direct meeting between the president of DRC and the president of Rwanda in Doha, brought together by the Emir of Qatar. And subsequently, the US actually came through its envoy that actually led to the negotiations in Washington, D.C. that brought together the foreign ministers of the two countries. And the US partly is also interested in its own economic conditions relating to particularly access to critical minerals in the DRC. And that interest forms part and parcel of this heavy engagement of the US around the resolution of the conflict in eastern DRC. I think for the eastern DRC, it doesn't matter who really, in the end, mediates or facilitates these talks. What matters the most is that the parties are willing and able to stick to the commitments that they have made. And there may be more incentive this time around because of the involvement of the US, and indeed, not just in terms of diplomatic engagement of the US, but also because of the economic interest that the US has for the two sides to try to do better than what we have seen since peace talks started in respect to the resurgence of the M23 in eastern DRC in 2022.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon Dersso, for speaking to us there, founding director of Amani Africa, joining us live there from Addis Ababa.